The night my HOA blocked an ambulance from reaching my house was the night everything changed. My name's Quentin O'Connor, and I wish I could say I was surprised when it happened, but dealing with Pearl Wainwright, the queen of the HOA, meant nothing was ever simple. She was the type of middle-aged nightmare who thought a clipboard and a cheap pair of sunglasses gave her the right to control everyone's life. It was a Saturday night, and my wife had a severe asthma attack. I called 911 immediately. The dispatcher told me an ambulance was on the way, so I ran outside to flag them down. That's when I saw it. 2 massive concrete planters, right in the middle of the access road in front of our house. Pearl stood there like she was guarding a treasure chest. Arms crossed, lips pursed, she barked, "This is a private road. Emergency vehicles can use the main gate. The main gate is under construction. You maniac," I shouted. "They need this road." Pearl didn't budge. She pointed to a laminated HOA map and said, "Not my problem. Rules are rules, Quentin." By the time the ambulance arrived, they had to park 2 blocks away and run uphill with all their equipment. My wife, Priya, was gasping for air while the paramedics struggled to get her stabilized. If they had gotten to her just a few minutes later, it could have been a whole different story. The next morning, I stormed into the emergency HOA meeting Pearl had called. She stood at the front of the clubhouse acting like some kind of dictator. I didn't wait for her speech. "You endangered my wife's life last night," I yelled. "You blocked an ambulance." Pearl, without missing a beat, sniffed and said, "Maybe if you kept your landscaping up to code, Quentin, we'd be more flexible." The room went dead silent. Even the other HOA members looked uncomfortable. I clenched my fists. "You have no idea what you just triggered," I said. Pearl laughed. "What are you going to do? Sue us?" I didn't answer then. I just turned around and walked out. But inside, I was already making plans. Real plans. The kind that would make Pearl wish she had never heard my name. I spent the rest of that Sunday gathering everything I needed. First thing I did was retrieve the footage from my security cameras, which had captured every second of Pearl and her cronies dragging those concrete planters into the roadway. I also pulled screenshots from the neighborhood group app, where Pearl had bragged about taking traffic control into her own hands. By Monday morning, I had a thick folder of evidence and an appointment with my attorney, Mr. Calhoun, a semi-retired bulldog of a man who used to be the city's chief prosecutor. When I laid everything out on his desk, he leaned back, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Quentin, this isn't just a civil issue. Blocking emergency services is a felony." I didn't need to be told twice. We filed a criminal complaint with the police and a civil lawsuit against the HOA itself. Calhoun also suggested we notify the local news stations. "Nothing makes bureaucrats sweat like cameras," he said. By Tuesday afternoon, a reporter from Channel 8 was standing on my lawn, microphone in hand, while I explained how my wife nearly died because of a few concrete planters. The footage from my security cameras played in the background during the evening news, showing Pearl directing the blockade like some discount traffic marshal. The fallout was immediate. The city dispatched a building inspector to audit the entire neighborhood. Turns out Pearl had authorized dozens of unauthorized modifications to common areas over the years. Fountains installed without permits, fences built across utility easements, even a so-called resident-only walking trail that cut across protected wetlands. Meanwhile, the police opened an investigation into the HOA board for obstruction of emergency services. Officers visited several board members at home, asking questions they clearly didn't want to answer. Pearl tried to act like she was untouchable, but the cracks were showing. Her husband, a meek accountant named Troy, emailed his resignation from the board the next day. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was tense enough to snap. Pearl tried to call the meeting to order, but half the room shouted her down. "You're a criminal, Pearl," a man from the back yelled. Pearl banged her gavel like that would restore order. "Everyone calm down. This is a misunderstanding." I stood up, holding a copy of the civil lawsuit papers. "You endangered lives. You abused your position. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is the beginning of the end for you. She pointed a trembling finger at me. You're exaggerating. It's not like anyone died. Gasps rippled through the room. People who had once been her staunchest supporters now looked at her like she had grown horns. The next morning, the city slapped the HOA with a cease and desist order forbidding any further modifications to roads or common areas. They also fined the HOA $50,000 for unauthorized construction. Pearl tried to claim the HOA didn't have the money to pay, but a quick audit revealed a slush fund she had been using for emergency projects, most of which were just vanity improvements she wanted. My attorney filed a motion to freeze the HOA's accounts until the court could sort out the civil damages. Meanwhile, the police investigation kept digging. They discovered that Pearl had used HOA funds to pay for personal landscaping at her home, disguised as neighborhood beautification. By the end of the week, Pearl was arrested for embezzlement and obstruction of emergency services. The moment the news broke, the entire neighborhood erupted. Some people hung justice for Priya signs in their windows. Others organized a community meeting independent of the HOA to discuss how to formally dissolve the current board. During the meeting, I was asked to speak. I walked up to the lectern, heart pounding but voice steady. We deserve better than people who think power is a toy, I said. We deserve transparency, accountability, compassion. People cheered. Real, genuine cheers. Not the forced clapping Pearl used to orchestrate at her meetings. Afterward, a woman named Maria, who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, approached me. She told me about how Pearl had fined her for planting unauthorized flowers in her front yard. Another man, Darren, said Pearl had tried to evict him over a flagpole he installed for his son's return from deployment. Story after story poured out. It was like the dam had broken. Everyone realized they had been isolated and bullied individually, but together they were unstoppable. Meanwhile, the city's district attorney announced additional charges against 3 other board members for conspiracy to misuse funds. Turns out Pearl hadn't acted alone. The city scheduled a formal review of the HOA's charter. If they found enough violations and it looked like they could revoke the HOA's authority altogether. It wasn't just about Pearl anymore. It was about taking back our neighborhood. 2 weeks later, a special election was held. New, honest residents were voted onto the temporary board. Their first act was to hire an independent auditor to go through every one of the HOA's financial records. The auditor's report was damning. Pearl and her cronies had collected illegal fines, charged residents for non-existent services, and funneled the money into personal projects. They had even used HOA funds to throw themselves private parties at exclusive country clubs. With the evidence mounting, the court granted our lawsuit. The HOA was ordered to pay damages to every resident they had wronged. The judgment totaled over $300,000. Because they couldn't pay, the court ordered the sale of the HOA-owned properties, the clubhouse, the greenbelt, and the private roadways. The city purchased them, repurposing the clubhouse into a public community center and opening the streets to unrestricted use. No more gates. No more barriers. No more Pearl. On a sunny Saturday morning, the city held a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Priya stood beside me, healthy and smiling, as the mayor cut the ribbon and declared the neighborhood officially free from HOA control. As the crowd celebrated, I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, people I had lived beside for years but had never truly known. Now we were united not by fear of fines but by shared victory. Pearl, out on bail and awaiting trial, had to drive through the open streets she once ruled, past the signs that now read, "Welcome to Willow Creek, a free community." And every time she did, she had to see the plaque mounted on the old clubhouse wall, dedicated to the residents who fought for their right to live without fear. It read simply, "In honor of those who stood up and reclaimed their home." We had taken everything she tried to control and turned it into something better. Something real. Something hers no longer. The weeks after the ribbon cutting brought a strange kind of calm to Willow Creek. For the first time in years, people walked their dogs without worrying about citations, kids rode their bikes without being chased down for trespassing, and neighbors who had barely spoken before now lingered at each other's fences, swapping stories about the dark days under Pearl's rule. But while life for the residents was getting better, Pearl's problems were just beginning to snowball. One Thursday morning, I was called to testify at a grand jury hearing. The district attorney was pushing for a full-scale indictment, not just for the obstruction charges that had already been filed, but for something far uglier. During the independent audit, investigators uncovered that Pearl had siphoned money meant for liability insurance premiums into a private offshore account. The HOA had been uninsured for over a year. I sat stiffly in the witness chair, hands folded, as the assistant district attorney, Ms. Patel, questioned me. Mr. O'Connor, to your knowledge, were residents informed that liability coverage had lapsed? No. We all paid our dues under the impression that the community was fully insured, I said, and had an accident occurred on common property during that time, we would have been personally liable. Every homeowner could have lost everything. Ms. Patel nodded grimly and thanked me. As I stepped down, I caught a glimpse of Pearl sitting at the defense table, her expression hollow. Her once carefully lacquered hair hung limp, and she twisted a tissue in her hands until it shredded. Outside the courthouse, news vans jostled for space along the curb. A reporter caught me before I reached my car. Mr. O'Connor, how does it feel knowing you helped uncover a major financial crime? I thought about Priya, gasping for air while Pearl stood in the road, puffed up with self-importance. I feel like the real work's just beginning. The grand jury didn't take long. Pearl was indicted on multiple felony counts: wire fraud, obstruction of emergency services, criminal negligence, and conspiracy to commit fraud. 3 former board members were named as co-conspirators. The court froze all their personal assets pending trial. Meanwhile, the city council voted unanimously to revoke Willow Creek's HOA charter permanently. No new HOA could ever be formed without a 2/3 majority vote from the entire neighborhood, a safeguard the residents pushed hard to enshrine. As the legal gears ground forward, life at Willow Creek blossomed. The city repaired the streets Pearl's board had neglected, installed proper emergency access signage, and opened a small public park where the old, unauthorized walking trail had been. One evening, Priya and I attended a community barbecue at the new park. Someone had strung fairy lights between the trees, and the smell of grilled burgers and fresh-cut grass filled the air. Maria, the woman Pearl had once found over flower beds, approached with a plate of cookies. You think Pearl's trial will be open to the public? She asked. It is, I said. Starts Monday. Darren, the veteran Pearl had tried to evict, grinned. I'm thinking about bringing popcorn. Laughter rippled through the group. It felt good, natural. Not the brittle, forced smiles people had worn before. Monday came sooner than expected. The courthouse was packed. Pearl's attorney, a wiry man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, tried to argue that she was merely misguided, not malicious. But the prosecution had a different narrative. They presented a timeline showing how, after years of small infractions, Pearl had escalated her behavior once she realized no one was watching closely. They showed bank records tracing the missing insurance premiums into a shell company Pearl secretly owned. They played the security footage of her blocking the ambulance, then layered in testimonies from paramedics who detailed how critical those lost minutes were. At one point, the prosecutor asked the lead paramedic to describe Priya's condition when they arrived. She was cyanotic, he said. Her lips were blue. She was minutes from respiratory failure. The courtroom went so silent you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Pearl's defense attorney tried to cast doubt, suggesting the paramedics could have used another route. But the city's emergency dispatcher took the stand and tore that idea apart, showing maps and call logs proving the main gate was inaccessible. When it was my turn to testify again, I didn't hold back. She didn't just block a road, I said. She gambled with my wife's life because she thought she was above the law. Pearl stared straight ahead, her face a blank mask. The trial lasted 6 days. On the 7th, the jury delivered the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 months later. In the meantime, Pearl was remanded into custody without bail. The judge cited her offshore accounts as evidence she was a flight risk. The fallout didn't end with Pearl. A civil suit was filed by the city itself, seeking damages for the unpermitted construction and environmental violations discovered under her leadership. It was the first time in city history that an HOA board was held personally liable for municipal costs. At the next community meeting, held in the newly renovated clubhouse, people buzzed about the sentencing hearing. "Think she'll get real time?" Darren asked, balancing a paper plate of pizza. Maria snorted. "After what she did. She's not seeing daylight for a long time." Priya squeezed my hand under the table. For the first time in months, her breathing was steady, her smile easy. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was once again full. Pearl's family sat stiffly in the back row, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The judge didn't mince words. "Ms. Wainwright, your actions displayed a blatant disregard for the safety, property, and trust of every resident you were elected to serve. You abused your authority for personal gain, endangered lives, and undermined the very fabric of this community." He sentenced her to 12 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for at least 8. The former board members received lesser sentences ranging from probation to 2 years in county jail, depending on their level of involvement. As Pearl was led away in handcuffs, she finally looked back at the courtroom. But there was no sympathy waiting for her. Only the stony faces of the community she had terrorized and tried to control. In the months that followed, Willow Creek transformed even further. Without the burden of an HOA, the neighborhood thrived. People repainted their houses in bright, cheerful colors. Gardens overflowed with wildflowers and vegetables. A local artist painted a mural on the side of the old maintenance shed, an image of a phoenix rising from ashes surrounded by the words, "We are free." One afternoon, as I was tending to the small vegetable patch Priya and I had started, a battered blue pickup truck pulled up. A man in a city uniform hopped out and approached. "You Quentin O'Connor?" he asked. I wiped my hands on my jeans. "Yeah, that's me." He handed me an envelope. "City Council wanted you to have this." Inside was a certificate of recognition, an official commendation for outstanding civic leadership and dedication to community restoration. I didn't need an award. Seeing Willow Creek alive again was enough. But it still felt good to know that in the place where chaos had once ruled, order and decency had finally taken root. The street Pearl had once practically owned now belonged to the people who lived on it. No gates, no barriers, no one standing in the way of an ambulance ever again. And every time the sun set over Willow Creek, casting its golden light over the open streets and blooming gardens, it was a reminder. The fight had been worth it. The weeks following Pearl's sentencing were a whirlwind of rebuilding and reevaluation for Willow Creek. Without the iron grip of the HOA, the residents were free to decide the future of their streets, their parks, and their lives. Yet, a deeper rot had been uncovered during the investigation, something even Pearl's trial hadn't fully brought to light. One afternoon, I received a phone call from Detective Navarro, one of the officers who had originally investigated the obstruction charges. His voice was clipped, urgent. "Quentin, you're gonna want to come down to City Hall," he said. "There's something you need to see." I found Navarro in a small, windowless conference room. Spread across the table were dozens of documents, some water-stained, others yellowed with age. He tapped a thick manila folder marked confidential. "We pulled the HOA's archived records after the fraud charges. Turns out Pearl and her board had been doing more than just embezzling funds," Navarro said. "They falsified property deeds." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "They illegally annexed portions of residents' front yards, claimed them as HOA-owned common property to justify fines and construction. In some cases, they even took out loans against those parcels. Loans they defaulted on." My stomach twisted. "How's that even possible without anyone noticing?" Navarro leaned back. "They bribed a former county clerk, small payments over years. Clerk's dead now, but the paper trail's clear. You and your neighbors never really owned your full properties during Pearl's reign. The implications hit me like a freight train. False liens, illegal land seizures, financial fraud on a scale none of us had imagined. What happens now? I asked. Navarro's mouth was a grim line. The city's filing a lawsuit to nullify every transaction Pearl's board conducted. But there's more. He slid another folder across the table. Inside were aerial photos of Willow Creek, marked with red and yellow overlays. Environmental Protection Agency got involved, he said. That walking trail they cut through the wetlands? It violated federal conservation laws. Could have triggered a fine of up to $2 million. I exhaled sharply. And now that's on us? He shook his head. Cities absorbing it. They're treating Willow Creek as a victim of organized fraud. You're not liable, but it's going to take time to clean up. I left City Hall feeling like the ground under my feet wasn't as solid as it looked. But there was no choice but to move forward. A week later, the city hosted a town meeting in the old clubhouse. It was packed standing room only. A representative from the Department of Justice, Ms. Langford, addressed the crowd. Because of the extent of the fraud, Willow Creek has been designated a federal recovery project, she said. This means the city, in coordination with federal agencies, will oversee all necessary repairs, restorations, and property corrections. Murmurs rippled through the room. Langford raised a hand. Additionally, the federal government has placed a lien on all assets formerly held by the corrupt HOA board. Sale of those assets will fund the restitution. Maria, standing near the back, called out, "What about the people who lost money paying those illegal fines?" Langford nodded. "You'll be fully reimbursed." Hope flickered through the room. Real hope. Not the brittle, desperate kind we used to cling to under Pearl's regime. But the biggest shock came a few days later. Navarro called again. "We need you at the demolition ceremony." I blinked. "Demolition?" He chuckled. "Trust me, you'll want to see this." On the day of the event, a crowd gathered at the entrance to Willow Creek. Heavy machinery rumbled along the street. City officials stood behind a makeshift podium, microphones clipped to their lapels. Mayor Alvarez stepped up first. "Today, we officially begin the removal of all illegally constructed structures tied to the former HOA's criminal activities." He gestured to the massive iron gates that had once blocked the main entrance, complete with stone pillars engraved with Willow Creek HOA. The machinery roared to life. A backhoe slammed into one of the pillars. It cracked and crumbled amid cheers from the crowd. The gates, once a symbol of exclusion and control, were torn down and hauled away like garbage. More demolitions followed. The illegally built security booth, the gaudy fountains Pearl had commissioned without permits, even the faux cobblestone roundabout she had insisted be installed without city approval, all of it ripped out. The city's Department of Public Works laid new sidewalks, planted native trees, and installed proper public signage. No gates, no barriers, just open, welcoming streets. Standing there with Priya's hand in mine, I felt a weight lift off my chest I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and streetlights flickered on, the neighborhood gathered for an impromptu celebration. Food trucks lined the newly opened streets. Kids chalked colorful drawings on the sidewalks. A local band played upbeat music on a flatbed trailer. Darren raised a plastic cup in a mock toast. To Quentin, the man who took down an empire with a security camera and a stubborn streak. Laughter and cheers broke out. I shook my head, laughing. It wasn't just me. It was all of us. As the band kicked into another song, Maria sidled up beside me. "You know," she said, "I heard the city's offering homeowners the option to buy back those strips of land Pearl stole. For $1. I blinked. $1. She grinned. Symbolic price. They want to make things right. News traveled fast. Within days, nearly every homeowner in Willow Creek had reclaimed their full lot. Deeds were corrected, liens erased, and restrictions lifted. For the first time since we moved in, Priya and I planted a real garden in our front yard. Not the sad, regulation-approved bushes Pearl had mandated, but wildflowers and herbs and a small lemon tree. Neighbors stopped by to chat, to trade seeds, to help each other build fences or paint porches. The sense of community, the real kind, not the forced, surveillance state version Pearl had enforced, blossomed everywhere. One evening, as I watered the garden, a beat-up sedan rolled slowly down the street. Inside sat Pearl, her hair unkempt, her face drawn. She didn't stop. She didn't wave. She just stared as she passed the open streets, the smiling neighbors, the laughter. I watched her disappear around the corner, swallowed by the neighborhood she had once ruled like a tyrant. And then I turned back to my garden, feeling no anger, no bitterness. Just peace. The recovery of Willow Creek wasn't just about tearing down gates or fixing paperwork. It was about reclaiming something far more important: trust, freedom, and the simple right to live without fear of petty tyrants. The street that Pearl had tried to turn into her personal kingdom was now truly ours. Open. Alive. Stronger than it had ever been. And no one, not Pearl, not any future would-be dictator would ever take that away from us again.